I will agree to this marriage." Those were the words Costanza said. Calm. Clear. No tears. She said them the way a person signs a contract, knowing exactly what they are giving up and doing it anyway. The Duke of Avellino was not a good man. That was what everyone in Florence said. They said he had no warmth, no patience, and no interest in being either. They said the servants inside his estate at San Gimignano spoke only in whispers. They said that if you crossed him, you would know about it before the week was out. And yet, on the third week of her marriage, Costanza heard something coming from behind a locked door at the end of the east corridor. It was music. Quiet, searching, deeply private music. Not the sound of a monster. The sound of a man carrying something very heavy. Alone. This story is a work of historical fiction. The characters, names, and specific events depicted in this narrative are entirely fictional and are not based on any real individual, living or deceased. While this story is set against the backdrop of real historical events, including the Napoleonic reorganization of Italy, the prefect administrative system, and the social structures of the Florentine merchant class in 1810, the characters and their personal experiences have been created purely for storytelling purposes. The historical context included in this video is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only. Every effort has been made to represent the period accurately, but this is not an academic or scholarly work. All characters, storylines, and situations are fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, events, or circumstances is entirely coincidental. To understand why Costanza said yes, you have to understand what her father had built, and what was about to be taken from him. Her father, Signor Forelli, was not a nobleman. He held no title, no land, no seat in the old Tuscan aristocracy. But in Florence in 1810, that did not mean he was without power. He was a senior member of the Florentine Commercial Council, the body of respected merchants who controlled the movement of silk, grain, and wool across the region. In the hierarchy of that world, a seat on the Commercial Council was not just a business position. It was a reputation. It was 40 years of trust built one agreement at a time. It was the reason doors opened when his name was mentioned and deals were made when his word was given. Now, here is something most people do not know. In 1810 Italy, a man's good name was treated almost like money itself. Merchants did not only trade in goods, they traded in trust. And trust, once broken, even by association, was nearly impossible to repair. This is different from how we think about business today. There were no formal contracts backed by courts in the way we know them. There were only reputations. A man whose name was attached to a scandal, even a scandal he did not cause, could lose everything he had spent a lifetime building. Not because of a law, but because people simply stopped doing business with him. That is exactly what happened to Signor Forelli. 11 months before Costanza's wedding, her father had co-signed a commercial bond with 3 other merchants. It was a normal arrangement. Nothing unusual about it. But one of those men, the 4th name on that bond, had been making private promises to a prefect's official that he could not keep. When those promises fell apart in public, the disgrace spread across all 4 names on that bond, including her father's. Within weeks, the invitations stopped coming. Old friends discovered other plans. Business partners began to find reasons to delay. Nothing was said directly. Nothing ever is, in those circles. But the message was clear. The Forelli name had been touched by scandal, and in Florence in 1810, that was enough. Costanza watched her father age 10 years in 3 months. Not from grief. From the particular exhaustion of a man who has done nothing wrong and cannot say so, because saying it would only draw more attention to the very thing he wants the world to forget. That is when the Duke's calling card arrived. Heavy cream paper. A ducal crest pressed into the corner. The name of Duke Leandro Avellino of San Gimignano, written in clean Roman lettering. No note attached. No explanation needed. A duke does not explain a calling card. The card itself is the message. And the message was simple. I am willing to attach my name to yours. In exchange for your daughter. Her father came to her that evening and told her plainly. He said she was under no obligation. He used those exact words. He was very controlled. He did not look at the window. Costanza looked at the window for both of them. She thought about what it meant to watch someone you love carry a weight they should not have to carry. She thought about the fact that she had the power to put it down for him. She said yes. Notice what is happening here. Nobody threatened Costanza. Nobody gave her an ultimatum. And yet she is standing in a room, making one of the biggest decisions of her life, because she cannot bear to watch the alternative. This is how social pressure works in real life, not with a raised voice, but with a quiet weight that nobody names out loud. In any era, in any country, if you ever find yourself saying yes to something important only because the cost of saying no feels too high, that moment is worth examining carefully. The answer may still be yes. But it should be a choice, not a surrender. The wedding was small. Correct. Quiet. The kind of event that gets the job done without pretending to be more than it is. A priest, a few witnesses, and two people standing side by side who barely knew each other's voices yet. Afterwards, Costanza was shown to her rooms and left to settle in. The Duke did not join her for dinner that first evening. Or the second. When he did appear at the table, he sat at the far end, read his correspondence, ate very little, and said less. He was not rude. He was simply absent, present in body, gone in every other way. Most people in Costanza's position would have accepted that. Many women in 1810 did. A quiet husband who left you alone was considered, by some, a reasonable outcome. You managed your household. You attended the expected social gatherings. And you built your life around the edges of a marriage that was more arrangement than partnership. Costanza was not built for that. She had grown up in a house where her father read commercial ledgers the way other men read novels, with complete attention, looking for the detail that did not fit, the number that told a different story from the one written above it. He had passed that habit on to her. She did not look at the Duke and see a cold, unreachable man. She looked at him and saw a man performing coldness. And those two things are very different. She began to watch him the way her father had taught her to read accounts. Not what was being shown, but what was being left out. The first thing she noticed was his hands. At breakfast one morning, about 2 weeks into their marriage, she saw ink on his left hand. Not the kind of ink that comes from signing letters and documents, that marks the right hand, the writing hand. This ink was on the left. The hand that holds a page open while the right hand copies from it. He had been up late, working on something private. Something he had not mentioned and clearly did not intend to. She said nothing. 3 nights later, unable to sleep, she took a candle and walked the east corridor of the estate. At the far end was a door she had always assumed led to a storage room. She had been told it was damp and not worth visiting. She heard music before she reached it. Low, slow, careful music. A cello played by someone who was not performing for anyone, not rehearsing for a gathering, not trying to impress. This was a man playing alone because he needed to. The kind of playing that happens when a feeling has no other way out. She stood in the corridor for a long time. Then she went back to her room. The following morning she found the housekeeper, a woman who had worked in that estate for over 30 years, and asked, carefully, in the indirect way that 1810 manners required, about the tower at the end of the east corridor. The housekeeper paused. The kind of pause that means a decision is being made about how much to say. Then she spoke. She said that the Duke had played the cello since he was a boy. That his father, the previous Duke, had considered music entirely beneath the dignity of a nobleman and had forbidden it inside the house. That for most of his life, the Duke had been allowed to play exactly once a year, on the single night his father spent away from the estate, at his club in Florence. 1 night a year to be himself. Every other night, he performed the version of himself his father had decided was acceptable. The housekeeper said all of this without emphasis, then went back to her work. But she had chosen to say it. That was not an accident. Costanza walked back to her room slowly. She was not in love with the Duke. She did not know him well enough for that. But she understood something now that she had not understood before. The man the whole of Florence was afraid of was not cold by nature. He had been made to perform coldness for so long that most people around him had stopped looking for anything else. She had not stopped looking. Most period dramas show the cold, distant nobleman as simply arrogant, a man who thinks he is better than everyone around him. But real history tells a more complicated story. Many men of that era performed hardness as a form of survival. A Tuscan nobleman under Napoleonic rule who appeared gentle or emotional could be seen as weak, and weakness, in that political climate, could cost a family its land, its title, and its standing. The Duke's coldness is not his character. It is his armor. Here is the lesson for all of us. A person who shows one face in public and a completely different one in private is worth watching carefully, but not judging quickly. Sometimes the private face is the real one, hidden because the world once punished them for showing it. Costanza does not decide she was wrong about him. She decides she needs more information. That is not naivety. That is wisdom. 6 weeks into the marriage, 2 letters arrived from Florence on the same morning. The first was official. The second was not meant to be seen at all. The first letter came from the prefect of Florence. Under Napoleon Bonaparte's reorganization of Italy, a prefect was the emperor's appointed authority in each region. He had the power to review estates, assess their productivity, and, if a fief was found to fall below the new imperial standards, seize it and redistribute it. This was not a threat invented for one family. It was happening across the whole of Napoleonic Europe. Old noble estates were being measured by new French accounting rules, and those that could not prove their value on paper were being taken. The Duke had 30 days to submit a full account of the estate's output, its workers, its revenues, and its land usage, in the new French administrative format, which his steward, a man trained in the old Tuscan way of record-keeping, had never used. That alone was a serious problem. The second letter made it far worse. It arrived privately, tucked inside a bundle of other correspondence. The Duke was called away to the courtyard before he could read it, and he left it open on his study table. Costanza passed through on her way to the library, saw the papers laid out, and read 3 lines before she understood what she was looking at. She read the rest. The letter was from a Florentine legal administrator, a man connected to the same network as the person who had destroyed her father's bond. It informed the Duke that certain individuals had already prepared a separate submission to the prefect. A submission made up of selectively chosen figures from the estate's records, real numbers, taken out of context, arranged to make the Duke's fief appear well below the required productivity level. In plain terms, someone was going to use the prefect's own review process as a tool to have the estate stripped. The land around San Gimignano was valuable. The Duke had no son. Under the imperial code, a seized fief would pass to the state, and those with connections inside the prefect's office could arrange to receive redistributed land very favorably indeed. Costanza stood at that table for a long time. She folded the letter back exactly as she had found it and placed it on the pile. That evening at dinner, she looked down the length of the table at her husband and asked him directly, without any softening, without any of the careful social politeness she had been using for 6 weeks, whether he had a plan. He went still. Not the controlled public stillness she had seen in him at court gatherings. This was different. This had edges. "You read the second letter," he said. It was not a question. "It was open," she said. "I read it before I understood what it was. You can be angry about that if you wish. But I need to know if you have a plan." A long silence. He put down his fork. He looked at her, the first fully direct look she had received from him in 6 weeks of marriage, and said something she had not expected. "I do not have one that will work in 30 days. Honest. No performance. No armor. Just the plain truth from a man who was, for the first time, not pretending." Costanza looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Then let me help you build one." Most drama creates a personal villain. Someone with a grudge, a rivalry, a face the audience can attach the danger to. What is happening here is more accurate to real history. Napoleon's administrative machine was used across Italy, Spain, Germany, and the Netherlands to strip old noble families of their land through perfectly legal processes. The threat was not a man with a sword. It was a man with a ledger. Real noble families in this period lost estates not through violence but through paperwork, and those with connections to the right offices knew exactly how to use that system against their enemies. What followed was 11 days of work. Not the romantic kind. Not the kind you see in stories where 2 people fall in love over candlelight and stolen glances. This was real work. Ledgers spread across a wide table. Figures checked and rechecked. Two people sitting on the same side of a problem for the first time. Costanza had grown up watching her father manage commercial accounts. She understood numbers the way some people understand language, not just what they said, but what they meant. She could look at a page of figures and see the story underneath them. And what she saw in the Duke's estate records was this: the estate was productive. The land was well managed. The workers were fairly treated and the output was strong. There was nothing wrong with the numbers themselves. The problem was the format. The prefect's office required submissions in the new French administrative style, a method of accounting that had been introduced across Napoleonic Europe to standardize how estates were measured. The Duke's steward had recorded everything honestly, but in the old Tuscan way. To the prefect's reviewers, who were trained to read only the new format, the records would look incomplete, unclear, easy to dismiss. That was exactly what the Duke's enemies were counting on. Costanza rewrote the submission. Every figure was the same. Not one number was changed. But she reorganized the records into the correct French format, cross-referenced the estate's grain output with the regional comparison figures the prefect's office used as their benchmark, and included a full account of wages paid, land improvements made, and workers employed. She turned honest numbers into a clear argument. One that could be read, understood, and, most importantly, not dismissed. On the fourth evening, the Duke brought coffee to the table without being asked. On the sixth, he corrected a measurement error in the land records before she noticed it. Small things. But in a marriage that had been built on distance, small things were everything. The submission was delivered to the prefect's office on the 26th day. The false submission, the one prepared by the Duke's enemies, arrived on the same afternoon, as planned. The hearing was set for 4 days later, in Florence. Here is what you need to understand about that hearing. In 1810 Italy, a woman attending a formal administrative proceeding before a Napoleonic prefect was unusual. It was not against the law, but it was the kind of thing people would talk about. A duchess seen managing her husband's affairs in a public legal setting would attract whispers. About her, about him, about whether he was strong enough to handle his own business. Those whispers, in the social world Costanza moved in, had a real cost. She knew this precisely. She had watched exactly this kind of talk damage her father's name. She attended anyway. She had prepared a formal written statement, in French, in the correct administrative language, that addressed every false claim in the opposition submission, point by point, with a specific reference to the imperial accounting code that made each claim incorrect. She gave the prefect's reviewers no room to dismiss it. The false submission was rejected. The estate was confirmed. San Gimignano stood. On the carriage ride back, the Duke was quiet for a long time. The Tuscan hills moved past the window in the late afternoon light. Then he spoke. "You understood what attending that hearing would cost you," he said. "Yes," she said. "And you went anyway." "Someone had to." He looked at her then. Not the measuring look she had grown used to. Not the controlled, assessing gaze of a man deciding how much to reveal. He simply looked. And for the first time since she had arrived at San Gimignano, she looked back without calculating what it would cost her. It was a beginning. Neither of them said so. But it was. The estate was saved. The threat was gone. The false submission had been dismissed and the men behind it had been left with nothing to show for their efforts. Life at San Gimignano continued. But it continued differently from the way it had begun. Here is what this story is really about. It is not about a woman who fixed a man. It is not about a marriage that became a fairy tale. It is about a choice, made clearly, with both eyes open, by a person who understood exactly what she was giving up and did it anyway. That is what sacrifice actually looks like. Not dramatic. Not announced. Just a quiet decision made in full knowledge of the cost. Costanza did not say yes to that marriage because she had no other option. She said yes because she chose to protect something she valued, her father's life's work, and she accepted the consequences of that choice without complaint. That kind of strength does not make noise. But it changes everything around it. The Duke was not saved by love. He was seen, honestly and clearly, by someone who chose to keep looking when everyone else had already decided who he was. That came first. Everything else followed from it. But the story did not end there. 1 week after the hearing, A letter arrived at the estate addressed to the Duke. No official seal. No return address. Just his name, written in a careful hand that Costanza did not recognize. The handwriting was a woman's. It had come from Milan. Costanza placed it on the tray with the other correspondence. She did not open it. She did not ask about it. But she did not forget it either. Because a woman who has learned to read what is being left out knows that a letter with no return address is never simply a letter. If this story stayed with you, if any part of Costanza's choice felt familiar, then you are exactly who this channel is made for. We bring you stories like this one every week. Real history. Real people. Real lessons wrapped inside stories that are impossible to put down. Hit the subscribe button right now so you never miss the next one. We will see you there. I created this story because we often forget that in 1810 Italy, the most dangerous prison a person could be placed in had no walls and no locks. It was built entirely out of other people's opinions. This narrative was inspired by the real tensions of Napoleonic Italy, a period when Bonaparte's administrative reforms dismantled centuries of old noble tradition and replaced them with a cold, French system of measurement and control. Under this system, your estate was only as safe as your paperwork. Your title was only as secure as the prefect's goodwill. And your family's standing, built over generations, could be attached to a stranger's scandal overnight, through nothing more than a shared signature on a commercial bond. I wanted to tell the story of the Duke not as a powerful, untouchable figure, but as a man who had been slowly hollowed out by a lifetime of performing a version of himself that his father demanded and his world rewarded. In the hierarchy of the Tuscan peerage under Napoleonic rule, a nobleman who showed softness was a nobleman who invited challenge. So he hid everything real about himself, the music, the manuscripts, the private grief, behind a reputation so cold that people stopped looking for anything underneath it. That is what drew me to Costanza. She was not a noblewoman. She had no title, no coat of arms, no seat at the table the Duke occupied. What she had was something the aristocracy of 1810 Italy consistently underestimated: the ability to read what was not being said. Her father had taught her that a good account tells the truth in a way that can be heard. She brought that skill into a marriage the world expected her to simply endure, and she used it to see a man that everyone else had already written off as a lost cause. It makes me think about the quiet sacrifices that never make it into history books. Costanza did not ride into battle. She did not write a famous letter or sign a famous document. She sat at a table for 11 days, rewrote a submission in a format her husband's steward did not understand, and walked into a room she was not expected to enter, knowing exactly what it would cost her and going in anyway. History is full of people like her. We just rarely stop to look. This story is a tribute to everyone who has ever protected something they loved without asking for credit. To everyone who has said yes to a hard thing not because they had no choice, but because they looked at the alternative and decided they could not live with it. That kind of strength does not wear a crown. It does not get a parade. But it is the thing that holds everything else together. True nobility, I have always believed, is not something you are born into. It is something you choose, quietly, at great personal cost, when no one is watching and no one will ever know. Costanza knew. And that was enough.